When the Bramley farm caught fire in 1871, the blaze consumed the entire house within minutes. Yet every member of the family, 9 in total, somehow survived. No burns, no signs of smoke elation. They were just standing in the field, watching the flames consume their home, in complete silence. From that moment on, not one of them ever spoke again, not to each other, not to anyone else, not aloud, not even in a whisper, not in court, not at the doctor's office. 28 years of absolute silence. Many tried to understand shock, psychosis, religion, punishment, but everyone who got too close lost something: peace of mind or the ability to speak. What made an entire family go silent forever? And what happened that night in the Bramley house that was better left burned to ash? There were 9 of them, and from a distance, the Bramleys looked like any other God-fearing, hard-working farm family in rural Indiana. The year was 1871, and their land, some 5 miles from the nearest township, Saturday low in a mist-prone valley near the edge of the Briar Creek woods. Their 2-story house, whitewashed, lopsided, and clinging to itself like a memory, leaned inward on its foundation, as if owing to some unseen pressure. A rusted weather vane turned sporadically, even on windless days, and the fence posts were always freshly painted, even when the house was falling into quiet disrepair. People noticed these things, but said nothing. The father, John Bramley, was a large man with calloused hands and a gait that suggested old injuries. He often wore his church coat, even in the fields, and kept his eyes downcast, as if afraid to meet the gaze of others. His wife, Agnes, was narrow and still, like a photograph caught mid-prayer. She was always seen with gloves, even in July, and she never smiled it out of coldness, but out of something else, something recessed. They had 7 children, 4 boys and 3 girls, all of them lean, pale, and composed. The oldest, Eli, was 16, the youngest, Ruth, just 4. Their appearances were similar enough that some mistook them for twins in various combinations. Though they were clearly born years apart, they moved in synchronized, measured ways, like parts of a machine that had never needed repair. No one ever heard them speak, not to each other, not to outsiders. Even in church, when hymns were sung, the Bramley children stood motionless with their mouths closed, hands clasped tightly before them, heads bowed. Only their eyes moved, flicking briefly toward the hymnals, then to the floor. The children attended school irregularly and always arrived together, never individually. Their clothing was identical: plain gray tunics, polished boots, and small black pins affixed to their collars, simple, circular shapes that looked handmade. When the teacher called roll, they raised their hands in silence. When asked to read aloud, they slid small pieces of paper forward with immaculate handwriting, in what the teacher described as strangely formal English, more suited to a courtroom than a classroom. Some of the words they used, the just witnesseth, had fallen out of use a generation earlier. The teacher once kept one of these notes and later claimed it had gone missing from her desk, though no one had entered the room. Recess presented a different mystery. While other children shouted and chased each other through the tall grass, the Bramleys Saturday beneath the same tree every day, facing inward, their heads slightly bowed. Occasionally, they would reach into their pockets and produce slips of folded paper, passing them in sequence, unfolding and refolding them as needed. They would stare at the paper for minutes at a time, then tuck it away. Once, a curious classmate tried to peek at one, but was intercepted by Ruth, the youngest, who simply stood up and turned her back to him. No one saw her mouth move, but he claimed he heard something to hum, low and wrong, that followed him for days afterward. At home, things were no less peculiar. Neighbors who passed by the Bramley farm noticed that the windows on the 2nd floor were nailed shut from the inside. Curtains were always drawn, even in summer, and the upper rooms never showed candlelight after dark. From time to time, distant sounds could be heard at night, slow, methodical creaks, like someone pacing in circles on the wooden floor. Sometimes, these footsteps would pause and resume, but never grew hurried, never strayed from the rhythm. More than one traveler described hearing the sounds continue until dawn. A traveling tinker who once stayed in the area recalled seeing the Bramley children standing perfectly still in the field behind their house at dusk. They formed a line, backs to the house, facing the woods. He watched them for a full minute. No any of them moved, even as the wind picked up. No adult was present. When he turned away and looked back, they were gone. He left town the next day. Though the family maintained a presence at the local church, their involvement was formal at best. They Saturday in the last pew. All 9 lined up in silent formation. They did not shake hands, did not linger for coffee or conversation. When communion was offered, they accepted it wordlessly and returned to their seats without even the faintest whisper. Once, the Reverend attempted to visit the Bramley home after Sunday service, bringing with him a small basket of bread and preserves. He left it on their porch and knocked, but no one answered. He waited nearly 20 minutes before hearing the slow drag of wood on wood from within dense silence. He never returned. Over time, stories began to form, whispered between neighbors with half-forgotten certainty. Some said the Bramleys were descendants of a French religious sect that had once roamed the Appalachian Mountains. Others believed they were protecting something or being punished. Theories bloomed and faded, but one thing remained consistent: no one ever heard them speak. And not just rarely, or only in private. Never. Not one syllable, not one cough, not even the accidental utterance in sleep or pain or laughter. One winter, a traveling census worker arrived at the Bramley property to take record. He was never invited inside, but stood on the porch as John Bramley filled out the necessary papers with deliberate strokes of the pen. When asked to confirm the ages of his children, he paused for a long time, then handed over the form. The ages were listed, but 2 of the names were the same. The census worker made a note and left. Months later, he returned to verify the discrepancy, but found the farm empty. The house stood quiet, and the snow outside remained unbroken by footprints. Some claimed that the Bramleys weren't silent by choice, that something had happened to them long ago, something that took their voices but left them functioning. Others believed it was a vow, a kind of sacred silence passed down as penance for a forgotten sin. There were rumors of a family photograph, taken years earlier, in which the children were all smiling an unnatural, fake smile that showed too many teeth. No one could find the photograph when asked. The mystery festered. Silence clung to the Bramleys like mildew to the corners of their home, seeping into the cracks, nesting in their clothing, growing behind their eyes. The town spoke about them in hushed tones, lowering voices whenever one of the children passed by. They rarely looked directly at them, not out of fear but out of unease, as if staring too long might invite something else, something hidden behind those still, sealed mouths. By the spring of that year, the Bramleys had withdrawn further from the world. They no longer brought produce to market. The barn doors remained locked even during harvest. No smoke curled from the chimney. No wagon tracks led into town. And yet, the fields were always perfectly tilled, the fences mended, the clothes on the line washed and hung, as though by unseen hands. They remained present without ever being seen, a family suspended in ritual, surrounded by questions that no one dared ask aloud, because deep down, the townsfolk suspected something they couldn't voice, that the silence was not just theirs. It was watching. It began with the cats. Not just the Bramleys, all of them, every barn cat, every stray, every half-wild mouser in the valley vanished in a single night. The Morrisons down the road noticed it first. Their tomcat, old Jack, was always waiting on the fence by dawn, but that morning, he was gone. So were the Graham's kittens, so was the brindled mouser that roamed the churchyard, and the mangy one that haunted the mill. What was left behind was worse than absence. Paw prints, down scenes of them, some deep, some shallow, all scattered and erratic, as though the animals had been fleeing. The trails all led in the same direction toward the Bramley farm and then disappeared entirely in the mud just before the fence line, swallowed by the earth like the ground itself had decided to end their path. Not a single track continued past that point. No bodies were ever found. A week later, Eli Bramley, the eldest son, stopped attending school. No explanation was given. The teacher received a letter delivered by a traveling grocer, folded once and sealed with a strange black wax that smelled faintly metallic. The note claimed Eli would now be homeschooled due to a private affliction. It was signed by Agnes Bramley, but the signature looked wrong, uneven, shaky, lacking the precise slant her previous letters always had. The ink bled at the edges, as if written with a trembling hand. The teacher tried to visit, just once, but turned back halfway down the path. She said later it felt like the trees themselves were leaning in to listen. Then came the incident at church. Hannah Bramley, the second to oldest daughter, had always been still more like a statue than a child, but during the third Sunday of Advent, she stood up in the middle of the sermon, slow and stiff, and began to claw at her chest. No sound came from her mouth, only a strained silence, like breath forced through clenched teeth. She dug her nails into her skin with such force that dark stains began to spread across her gray dress. No one moved. Her siblings stared straight ahead. Agnes Saturday unmoved, lips barely moving, eyes locked on a hymn book that had not been opened. John stood, took Hannah by the shoulders, and led her out of the chapel without a word. The door creaked open, closed. The sermon resumed. The congregation did not ask questions, but they began to sit farther away. Whispers gathered like dust. One neighbor, an old woman named Mrs. Gray, claimed to have seen something from her upper window on a fog morning. She had woken early to tend to a sick bird, and glanced out toward the Bramleys' land. There, she saw the children, all 7, standing in the field behind their home. They were barefoot, arranged in a circle, arms slightly outstretched, each holding what looked like the skull of an animal, some large, some small, a goat, perhaps, a fox, a raccoon. Their heads were tilted downward, and on the earth between them was a chalk pattern, pale, intricate, and spreading far wider than any child's hand could have drawn alone. A labyrinth, or a sigil, she could not tell. She set the fog scene together only around them, heavy and unmoving. She blinked and the scene was gone. After that, strange patterns began appearing in the fields, perfect concentric circles carved into the earth. The soil inside turned black as if burned, though no fire had touched it. The farmer who owned the land, just south of the Bramleys, woke one morning to find all his scarecrows missing, 3 in total. He found them a day later in the middle of his barley field, standing in a triangle. Their clothes had been turned inside out, their eyes but and stitched lovingly by his wife had been removed. Hannah, meanwhile, began showing up at church with gloves like her mother's. On warm days, with long sleeves, her posture grew even more rigid. Once, during the final hymn, a parishioner sitting behind her noticed tiny tremors in her shoulders. When he leaned forward, he realized she was shaken from fear or cold, but like a muscle resisting its own body. It became clear that the Bramley children no longer blinked. A letter arrived at the Reverend's door one dusk, left without a knock, no return name. Inside was a single sentence, written in the same slanted script that had signed Eli's school note. "We have made our vow." Nothing more. Then came the sounds. Neighbors lying awake began to hear low vibrations in the air, like chanting carried on a wind that never touched the trees, a guttural rhythm, just below human hearing, rising and falling in a pulse that felt organic. One man claimed to have heard his name whispered outside his bedroom window, except his wife had heard it too. When he opened the shutters, there was nothing, but in the grass below, something had been written in thin, parallel grooves, as if carved by fingernails, the word, "Remember." Livestock started turning up with their eyes clouded over, not deer, just silent, rigid, staring, as if something had passed through them. A schoolboy named Jacob, known for teasing the Bramley children, disappeared on his way home. His hat was found beside the bridge near Briar Creek, weighted down by a stone. His shoes were never located. His parents wept openly in church, but the Bramleys remained stone-faced. A week later, the school received a package wrapped in muslin cloth. Inside was a bundle of feathers, arranged like a bird's wing, except every feather was the same length. No note, no origin. Nightfall took on a new texture. People began to sleep in shifts. Doors were barred, lamps left burning until dawn. Dogs, once plentiful, were kept inside or given away entirely. One boy swore he saw Ruth Bramley standing alone in the churchyard past midnight, barefoot and humming with her mouth closed. When he told his mother, she slapped him across the face and told him to pray. The chalk labyrinth reappeared, first in the schoolyard, then on the doors of the general store, then scratched into the dirt beside the church steps, always identical, always smudged, as though someone had tried to erase them too late. The sheriff came to investigate, but left after only 1 hour. When asked why, he simply muttered, "They aren't breaking any laws," and walked away. The postman refused to deliver letters to the Bramleys. He left all parcels at the end of the road, beneath the old sycamore. They always disappeared before morning. He never saw who came for them. A month after Eli's withdrawal, the teacher received another letter, this one unsigned. It contained a single phrase, "Speech binds, silence protects." She quit 2 days later. And through it all, the Bramleys remained, unmoving, unchanged, eyes calm, voices absent, movements deliberate, as if nothing had shifted at all. But to the town, something had broken loose, something invisible but vast, a rawness too complex to name, too quiet to confront. The cats never returned. The fire came without warning. October 5th, 1871. A night slick with silence, no storm, no wind, no lightning in the sky. The stars blinked cold and distant above the Bramley farm, their light barely touching the roof of the house that had long seemed to pull away from the world. Nothing stirred, nothing creaked, and yet, at precisely 2:14 a.m., a plume of smoke rose upward like a beckoning finger, curling slow and deliberate toward the heavens. It didn't begin in the kitchen, not in the hearth or the flue or the pantry, with its neat rows of preserved fruits and silent jars. Witnesses would later insist, with pale faces and shaking hands, that the fire bloomed from above, from the attic, from that sealed and shuttered place no one had ever entered or seen, where windows had long ago been nailed shut and never reopened. The flames moved unnaturally sideways, down through the rafters before rising again. They twisted like rope, not wild and chaotic like fire ought to be, but purposeful, as though retracing old paths. Glowing red veins spread through the boards like infection. Smoke bled through the walls, and yet there was no sound from within, no screams, no cries, not even the splinter of breaking wood, just the crackle of something ancient being undone. By the time the neighbors saw the glow across the valley, the sky above the house was a dull, living orange. Farmers rushed from their homes, barefoot in night clothes, grabbing buckets and barrels and anything that could carry water. But by the time they reached the edge of the Bramley field, the house was already consumed. A breathing wall of fire encased it, not collapsing, not faltering, just burning, as though it had always waited for this. And there, standing at the edge of the field, lit in flickering silhouette, were the Bramleys. All 9 of them, silent, still, alive. They stood in a perfect line, backs straight, arms at their sides, faces turned toward the inferno. The children, in their identical gray garments, were barefoot despite the cold. Agnes, her gloved hands clasped loosely before her, watched the house with no visible expression. John, the father, had removed his hat and held it against his chest. The fire painted their features in shifting tones, black, orange, and then, at times, something colder, a brief flicker of blue, like the last breath of a dying ember. 3 volunteer firemen, red-faced and weazened from the sprint, approached the family with soaked scarves tied over their mouths. They shouted names, questions, orders, but the Bramleys didn't flinch, didn't move, not a glance, not a blink. Their eyes never left the house. One of the firemen, in a moment of desperation, reached out to touch the shoulder of the eldest son, Eli. His hand stopped inches away, gripped by sudden, unreasonable dread. He would later claim that the air around the boy shimmered, just slightly, like he'd risen from stone, not warm, dull, cold, bitter cold. And then, without sound or warning, the fire died. Not smothered, not quenched, it simply ceased. One moment it devoured the structure in spiraling tongues, and the next it was gone. Only smoke remained, thick and clinging to the bones of the house. No beams fell, no embers lingered. The ground hissed underfoot, but there was no water to cause it. What was left of the house stood like a carcass, black and skeletal. Inside, they found almost nothing. No furniture, no clothing, no books. The walls were scorched bare. The floorboards upstairs had warped into strange, concentric curves. The kitchen table had split clean down the center as if by a blade. But on the attic floor, untouched by ash or heat or flame, was a single iron box. It sat directly in the center of the attic, where no stairs led, surrounded by soot in every direction. The box was about the size of a shoebox, iron gray, dulled with age, and sealed with two locks each different. Neither burned, no scorch marks marred its edges. The wood beneath it was clean, unburned, cold. The sheriff took it into evidence and brought it to the rectory. The local blacksmith was called in to open the locks. They didn't break them, they simply opened, one after another, with a sound like cracking ice. Inside the box were 7 folded slips of parchment, yellowed but unburned, one for each child. Each note bore the same phrase, in identical handwriting: "Do not open your mouth, he lives there." There was no signature, no date. The letters were written in what the Reverend described as a hand far too steady to be human, every line perfectly even. The ink shimmered in candlelight. The notes were kept for study, but within days, the parchment began to decay and burn, not rot, but crumble into fine gray dust, like the ash of paper that had never been lit. The iron box, once cold, began to grow warm to the touch, not hot, but fevered. The Reverend eventually buried it in the church graveyard under a nameless stone. He never said why. Meanwhile, the Bramleys did not speak. They moved into the barn without explanation. No repairs were made to the house. No one asked if they needed shelter, or food, or prayer. They remained on the edge of their land, watching the charred ruin of their home for 3 nights, standing vigil as if at a wake. On the 4th night, they returned to their work without ceremony. The town tried to continue, but things had changed. The milk curdled faster, wells took on a bitter taste, candle flames bent against the wind, children refused to pass the Bramley land without crossing themselves, animals avoided the area entirely. And once, only once, someone saw movement in the upper window of the burned house. The window that should not have been there anymore. A pale shape, gaunt and slow, passed across the blackened frame. It paused, and then it turned. The witness, a teenage girl named Bethany Morris, did not describe what she saw, only that the thing had eyes, familiar ones, eyes like Eli Bramley's. But Eli had been standing beside his siblings in the barn. After the fire, no one saw the Bramleys enter town again. No produce appeared on their usual stall at the Sunday market. No footsteps marked the road to the church. No visitors were received. The only signs of life were the perfectly stacked wood piles outside the barn, and the rows of crops that continued to grow unnaturally straight as lines drawn by a ruler, crops no one harvested. One traveler, a mapmaker unfamiliar with the region, passed near the property weeks later. He claimed to hear what sounded like humming low, harmonic, like a choir holding a single note for breathless hours. He followed it until it stopped. When he turned to leave, he saw 9 sets of footprints in the dirt behind him. Only one set led away. The others remained, toes pointing forward, toward him. For decades, the town had whispered. Whispers became habits, and habits became silence. The Bramleys had been left to their own perimeter, an invisible border drawn not by fences, but by dread. No one crossed it, no one asked, no one needed to, until someone did. A young seminarian named Elias Core was the first to dig, fresh from theological school and heavy with the self-righteousness of untested faith. He came to the valley to assist the aging Reverend Palmer. He arrived with books and ideals, and for a time was content to catalog crumbling church records, but old names began appearing too often. Bramley, 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 always signed in strange ink, always with symbols pressed into the paper margins, like impressions from a ring. Symbols Elias didn't recognize, but couldn't forget. His curiosity, once a flicker, grew into something hungrier. He began visiting the county archive, cross-referencing census records with marriage and death certificates. He noticed patterns others had long learned to ignore. The Bramleys had never buried their dead. No tombstones, no recorded deaths, no funerals, yet generations had passed. There were mentions of previous Bramleys dating back almost 100 years. Same names, reused, or perhaps never replaced. One night, he found a locked drawer in the rectory cellar, its key hidden beneath a loose stone. Inside were mold-eaten documents, yellow with age. Some were written in Latin, others in an archaic form of English thick with strange spelling. And among them, he found the letters. They were tied in a bundle with a blackened ribbon that cracked when touched. Each was addressed to the church from John Bramley, the patriarch. The earliest dated letter was from 1854, the latest, from 3 years after the fire. But John had never returned to the church. He had sent these notes, unsigned, delivered by hand at night. Elias read them by candlelight. They spoke of a doctrine older than the church, a covenant passed from tongue to ear to flesh, a sect named, unaffiliated, that believed voice was a gateway, not metaphorically, not spiritually, literally. They called it the mouth of God, but what they described was not divine. It was something that listened and answered, always answered. According to these letters, speaking without purpose was like casting stones into still water. Eventually, something stirs, something watches. The sect taught that each word carried weight. A phrase, a sentence, could open doors not meant to be opened. Language was a ritual, an invocation, and once a name was spoken, truly spoken, it could not be unsaid. John Bramley had once belonged to them. He had left the group after it fractured. A schism had torn the believers apart when one member, in anger, shouted a name, an unclean name. They say during a gathering. That night, his house was consumed by fire. The next morning, The land beneath it had split open, revealing a pit that bled steam for 3 days. Nothing grew there again. The survivors divided. Some fled, others vanished. John remained, and then he began his family. The letters revealed something worse. The silence was not an act of devotion. It was a seal, a necessity. The children were raised not to speak out of piety, but survival. Once, John wrote, his second daughter had whispered during sleep. The following night, the family barn filled with an impossible stench. Their livestock were found mutilated, but not eaten, arranged, faces turned to the north, eyes plucked clean. The girl was punishing it to appease a god, but to remind her body never to speak again. Elias found accounts of monthly rituals, marked by the lunar calendar. Every 28 days, the family gathered to renew the vow. They drew sigils and salt around the perimeter of their home. They bled themselves in a pattern minor wounds, precise and deliberate. If one failed, the others carried the mark. They shared silence as one might share breath. Those who broke the vow faced correction. Elias found a page torn from an old Bible, notated in cramped script. A wound on the tongue is better than a door ajar. On the back, a drawing childish, frantic cough, a mouth sewn shut. Then came the report from the sheriff's archive. A boy, unnamed, found dead in a ravine behind the old quarry. No clothing, no shoes, a leather belt around his neck, not drawn tight enough to strangle. Carved into the belt were the words, "I tried to sing." The death was ruled misadventure. No charges were filed. But the handwriting on the belt matched a sample from Agnes Bramley. Elias became obsessed. He stopped attending Sunday sermons. He roamed the edge of the Bramley property, taking notes. He sketched symbols left in the dust, in the bark of trees. Once, he claimed he saw a circle of dead birds surrounding the old barn, beaks shattered, wings intact. One evening, driven by the fever of knowledge, he crossed the threshold. It was twilight. Fog moved low and fast across the fields, unnatural for the season. The barn stood like a crouched animal, watching him. He approached slowly, notebook in hand, every step harder than the last. The door creaked open without touch. Inside, there was no furniture, no hay, no warmth, just a circle of stones at the center of the floor, and above it, hanging by a rope of hair, a crude wind chime made of teeth. He didn't remember running, only the sound of something breathing behind him. Not in rage, but in anticipation. After that night, Elias refused to speak. Not a word. He wrote only once, before vanishing. On a single page he scrawled, "The silence is not theirs, it is ours. They keep it for us." The Reverend burned the page. But it was too late. The secret had slipped. It had a shape now, a form, a trail. That winter, 5 families moved away without explanation. Livestock miscarried. Infants were born with their mouths sealed by a thin veil of skin. One man cut his own tongue out, then wandered into the woods and never returned. A schoolteacher found chalk symbols scratched beneath every desk in her classroom, identical, symmetrical, like something etched by insects. She quit the next day. The town began to fracture in small ways. People stopped singing hymns, stopped telling stories. Laughter became rare. Whispering became the only safe way to speak. And the Bramleys watched, silent, steady. But the secret had escaped. It lived now in margins, in throat and ear and breath, in half-spoken prayers and broken lullabies. It waited, always, it waited. Because once you knew that speech had weight, you could feel it in every word. And something else could feel it too. After the fire, the Bramleys moved into the barn. Not rebuilt, not repaired, just the barn hollowed, soot-stained, ribs of wood left black and splintered from smoke. They carried nothing from the house, no chairs, no photographs, no beds, and, as would become clear, no mirrors. Neighbors said the family worked in silence from dawn to dusk. Agnes, the mother, would rise first and open the barn doors at sunrise. Her hands red from cold or something else, no one could tell. The children, those who remained, followed wordlessly. Stepping barefoot onto frost-covered earth, they tilled soil that refused to yield. They watered plants that did not bloom, but they did it daily, as if the ritual mattered more than the result. No one ever saw them eat. Local officials came after the first frost, a clergyman, a constable, and a physician. They had been pressured by townsfolk, who no longer felt safe living so close to the Bramleys. But the family had broken no law. They were not abusive. The children bore no bruises, only the stillness of deer who'd learned never to cry out when questioned. Each child passed a piece of paper to the officers, the same message, written by different hands. We have made a vow. We are safe. The physician left first, visibly shaken. The clergyman followed after a single look into the barn's interior. Only the constable remained behind a while longer, pacing near the fence line, lighting cigarette after cigarette, though he never smoked. He took to drinking soon after, hung himself the following spring. As winter deepened, the family retreated entirely into the barn. No lights were ever visible, no footprints around the threshold, and yet they were seen from time to time wandering the field in a slow procession, all dressed in white, heads bowed, carrying nothing. Then the deaths began. The first was Emma, the second youngest. The local doctor, when summoned, examined her in the barn by lantern light. She was pale, impossibly so, her lips bloodless, her lungs, he claimed, showed no signs of damage or fluid. He whispered to the sheriff afterward that she refused to breathe right, not couldn't, refused. She was buried without ceremony in the frost-bitten ground behind the barn. No marker, only a circle of ash. 6 months later, her older brother Peter vanished. They found his boots at the edge of the old quarry, neatly placed side by side. His coat hung from a tree branch nearby, sleeves buttoned in the pocket. A folded scrap of linen bore only one word inside. No search party was formed. Over the next decade, the family diminished, one by one, always in silence. No death was contested, no disappearance reported. It was as if the town, and the Bramleys themselves, had made peace with attrition. Only Agnes remained constant. Agnes and the circle she tended, a ring of scorched earth that never greened, never shifted. Children from town who dared venture close claimed to see her kneeling there at night, head tilted toward the ground as if listening. Her hair grew long and gray, tangled with leaves. Some swore they heard her humming, others said it was the wind. By 1899, no one left the barn anymore, no feet in the fields, no forms at the windows. The doors remained shut even during harvest and storm. Rumors spread of sickness, madness, suicide, but few dared confirm them. That winter, after a particularly violent storm, smoke was seen rising from the old house's foundation, the place where the fire had started all those years ago, though the house had long collapsed into ruin. Townsfolk found Agnes there the next morning. She was seated before what remained of the hearth, her dress singed, hands burned but not bleeding. Around her, a circle had been carved into the floor, not in chalk or salt, but scorched directly into the wood. In her lap lay a bundle wrapped in coarse linen, stitched with thread so dark it shimmered violet in the morning light. When unwrapped, it revealed tongues. Not human, not animal, not flesh, fabric, perhaps, or something like it, a down scene of them, bound together with a cord made from braided hair. Each one bore a different symbol, burned or etched along the edge. None matched any known alphabet. On the wall behind her, written in soot and ash, were the words, "Silence is a form of love." Agnes did not speak, not when carried to the infirmary, not when questioned by county investigators, not even when her body began to fail. Her mouth remained closed, her eyes open, staring at something behind the world. She died 3 days later. Her last written note was found beneath her pillow, folded 7 times, the paper brittle as old skin. It read, "We did not keep the silence to save ourselves. We kept it so it would forget the sound of us." The barn was boarded shut by the town council. No family came to claim the land. No relatives appeared. Eventually, the property was auctioned to a distant buyer who never visited. The structure was left to rot, consumed by moss and mildew, until it collapsed inward like a dying lung. But the circle remained. In the spring of 1902, a group of schoolboys found it again. They stepped inside, dared each other to stand in the center, to speak, to shout. One of them, James Thayer, aged 12, whispered a nonsense rhyme. The following week, he was found on the roof of the schoolhouse, barefoot and shivering. He would not speak, would not eat. His eyes were full of something no child should see. The doctor called it catatonia. His mother called it punishment. By summer, more children fell silent, not all at once, not completely, but slowly, as if forgetting how. Their mouths moved, but no sound came. Some began drawing circles in chalk. Others refused to enter churches. One child, when asked to recite a poem, began to bleed from the nose and ears before collapsing. The town began to die then, not in fire, not in flood, but in hush. People moved away, stores closed, The church bell was taken down after it cracked during a thunderstorm. Letters to the council went unanswered. By 1910, only 7 families remained. None had children. And through it all, the barn stood. Collapsed, yes, but never quite dead. On moonless nights, travelers along the old county road swore they could see a pale figure seated among the wreckage, hands folded, as if in prayer. Others heard sounds not quite human, not quite wind, a scraping, a muttering, a voice without breath. No one stopped anymore. No one lingered. The silence remained. And the thing that once listened, whatever it was, had not forgotten how the Bramleys sounded. The field where the Bramley house once stood was unremarkable at first glance as just an expanse of dry grass that never grew taller than a child's knee, regardless of the season. The soil was gray beneath the roots, dense and sour to the touch. Nothing blossomed there. No birds circled above it, and though no fences remained, people walked in long arcs around it, like some buried instinct warned them not to cross the invisible line. Developers had tried, a few, lured by the low price and the pretty symmetry of an open space, but none stayed. One man left in the middle of the night without his shoes. Another boarded at the windows of his prefab cottage, painted crosses and black tar on the walls, and locked himself inside. When neighbors finally forced the door open, they found him curled in the bathtub, mouth sewn shut with fishing line. The thread was still clutched in his fingers. That house was razed. No one bought the land again. In the county museum, behind dusty glass and forgotten plaques, lies the worn diary of Arthur Nettle, the schoolteacher who once taught all 6 Bramley children. Its pages are brown and brittle. The ink faded to a shade like dried blood. It was found in a locked drawer of the old schoolhouse after it closed. Most entries were banal weather notes, arithmetic exercises, discipline records, but deeper in the journal, the tone shifted. Arthur had grown uneasy with the Bramley children, not for misbehavior, for they never caused trouble. It was their silence, the way they moved together like limbs of a single organism, the way they listened, always listening, especially to the youngest Eli. Eli, Arthur noted, had begun to write things he couldn't have known, biblical passages not found in the Bible, symbols he could not have seen. Once, the boy passed him a folded scrap of paper with a sentence that read, "If you heard the way he speaks at night, you'd never open your mouth again." Arthur wrote that the paper was cold when he touched it, and that it had not come from any notebook in the classroom. He never punished Eli for writing things like that. He just returned the paper and told the boy never to give him notes again. After the fire, Arthur wrote fewer entries, but one, dated 2 days after the Bramley house burned to its foundation, was a single line. They didn't do it out of fear. They did it out of love. What they did was everything: the silence, the rituals, the vow, the wounds, the disappearances, all of it. And for years, the only question that lingered like a stain was why. Some believed they were mad, victims of generational delusion, a family swallowed by its own myth. Others claimed it was a cult, a pocket of unsupervised religious mania left to fester too long. There were theories of abuse, of trauma, of psychosis passed down like heirlooms, all logical, all unsatisfying, because something remained. People who walked through the field of end briefly sometimes left coughing, not from dust or pollen, but from something deeper, as if their lungs had been coated in soot, though no fire had touched them. At first, the cough was dry, then wet, then hoarse. Some took months to heal, some never did, and some simply stopped speaking. Not out of fear, not out of pain, but as though language itself had betrayed them. First for a day, then a week, then longer. One woman, a hiker who'd cut across the field unaware, lost her voice by the time she reached her car. Doctors found nothing physically wrong. She communicated with notes, then stopped those too. A year later, her brother claimed she hadn't made a sound in months, that even in her sleep. He found pages in her journal filled with circles and slashes. No words, just shapes, like the kind burned into the barn walls all those years ago. It had been 28 years since the last Bramley was seen alive, and not once had a word escaped the family that could be considered a mistake. Not once had they broken the promise. In the years following the fire, researchers and amateur historians came in waves. A group of parapsychologists visited in the 1980s, bringing instruments and cameras. None of them stayed longer than 3 nights. One was later found wandering along a back road in his underclothes, mouthing something that made no sound. His tongue had withered like old fruit. A tape from that investigation surfaced briefly before being lost in a flood. Its contents were never officially transcribed, but one archivist who claimed to have heard it said the recording was mostly silence until the last 30 seconds. Then, there was a voice, not loud, not angry, just wrong, a kind of phonetic collapse, a sentence that wasn't a sentence, made of syllables that felt like they didn't belong in this world. The archivist never repeated what he heard. When asked, he would only say, it wasn't what was said, it was what it made you want to say after. That was always the thing. The voice didn't force anything, it invited. The Bramleys, it seemed, had discovered this the hard way, and what they built around themselves was not madness. It was insulation. They had become the walls of the house that no longer stood. Their mouths were bricks, their silence, mortar, their lives, scaffolding. They contained something, or protected the world from it, perhaps both. In one final note, buried in the church archives, was a confession written by a nun who had visited the family during one of their ritual observances. She said the children were not afraid, that they knelt in perfect stillness, eyes closed, hands over their own lips, not because they feared punishment, but because they loved the thing behind the voice too much. She wrote, the youngest child smiled the whole time. He was humming, but no sound came, and I swear to you, I could hear something humming back. She left the convent the next day and took a vow of silence of her own. No one has spoken on the Bramley land in decades. It's not law, it's not superstition, it's simply something you don't do. Even those who don't know the story feel it like pressure behind the teeth, like a word trying to force itself up from below the tongue. And somewhere beneath that field, beneath the rotten ash and silence, something still listens,